What if I told you that the truest love doesn't start with passion, but with silence, with glances that avoid meeting, cold dinners, and rooms separated by more than just walls? This is the story of Clara and Alexander, two strangers who signed a marriage contract without exchanging a single promise. 2 years together, without touches, confessions, or affection. But destiny is persistent. And when a cold, calculating CEO begins to see the woman who's always been there, not as a social alliance, but as someone who could save him from himself, everything changes, and what was once mere convenience transforms into a choice, into a new beginning, into real love. Get ready to feel. Because this story will take you down paths of held-back pain, slow reconciliation, and a rebirth that only happens when two broken hearts decide to try together. Now tell me, do you believe that love can be born after marriage? If this story resonates with you, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and leave a like. It helps us a lot to keep bringing stories that heal, inspire, and transform. And of course, share with someone special who needs to believe that love can bloom even after everything. Comment below. Where are you listening to this story from? Alexander Reed had always been a man of few words, not out of lack of substance, but due to an excess of control. At 47, he led Reed Enterprises with the same cold precision with which he managed his personal life, everything meticulously planned, immune to flaws or surprises. His name was respected in the business world, feared by competitors, and revered by investors. But there was one wing of the mansion in Boston where silence echoed louder than any public recognition. The wing where Clara Bennett slept, his wife. Their marriage wasn't born from promises exchanged under moonlight or vows whispered between laughs. It was sealed in clauses, interests, and agreements, a pact between two families in quiet crisis. The Reeds, under pressure from scandals and stock market instability, needed an impeccable public image. The Bennetts, drowning in debt and facing imminent bankruptcy, needed salvation. Clara became the bargaining chip. The only daughter of a university professor and a fading artist, Clara never imagined that at 28 she'd be exchanging rings with a man 20 years her senior, almost a stranger. Her world had been filled with old books, fragile pages that she restored with care and love. Her hands smelled of aged paper, and her dreams were romantic, tucked away in the back of a drawer. But on that cold October morning, when she said yes in front of a crowd that applauded a staged performance, she felt something inside her die. The Reed mansion was stunning from the outside, but inside it hid cold hallways, thick walls that blocked the sound of life. Alexander and Clara lived in opposite wings, he in the main chambers, she in the converted guest rooms. They shared the last name, the dinner table at social events and appearances, but they didn't share a touch, a glance, a word. They were two strangers walking in silence down a path they never chose to walk together. Sometimes Clara wondered if Alexander remembered the name of the perfume she wore, if he noticed the way she adjusted her glasses when reading, if he knew that she preferred storms over sunny days. But he only greeted her with a polite nod and disappeared into meetings, commitments, and endless travel. And she filled the void with books, with restoration ink and fine brushes, with lukewarm coffee and unsent letters. She felt invisible. She didn't hate Alexander. That would be too strong a word for what existed between them. What she felt was absence. It was like living in a house where all the furniture was in place, but no one ever sat at the table. In the rare times they were together in public, their gestures were choreographed. An arm linked here, a rehearsed smile there. Photographers smiled. Newspapers published headlines about the sophisticated couple. And they both returned to the car in silence. No questions, no answers. Not even the courage to say that this life was suffocating them both. Alexander, in turn, hid his turmoil behind the perfectly adjusted tie. He thought he was fulfilling his role, ensuring stability, protecting the family empire, offering security to a young woman who had been thrust into the same machine that had imprisoned him for as long as he could remember. But he had never, not even for a second, allowed himself to see Clara as anything beyond a necessary piece on the chessboard. It was easier to keep his distance, safer not to feel. However, even in the coldest of stories, destiny tends to spark fires where they're least expected, and one of those sparks was about to set fire to the veil of formalities that concealed their colorless marriage. That Friday morning, Clara entered the music room of the mansion, one of the few spaces she truly loved in that place. She sat at the piano as she did when she needed to breathe, and played Chopin. The soft notes filled the air with a melancholy that danced between the linen curtains. What she didn't know was that Alexander, standing in the hallway, had stopped to listen. Unintentionally, without planning it. And in that very moment, for the first time in 2 years, something inside him faltered. It was the beginning of a crack, not a major twist, nor a heroic gesture, but a hesitation, a microscopic step, a sound that echoed inside a man who had made silence his fortress. And when Clara finished the last note and closed her eyes, still unaware she was being watched, Alexander turned, but didn't leave immediately. He stayed there for a few seconds longer than he would have, and that detail, as small as a held-back sigh, already signaled that something was about to change, even if neither of them had the courage, yet, to face what would come next. The Metropolitan Hall in Boston radiated sophistication that night. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above long gowns, stiff collars, and champagne glasses that clinked amidst rehearsed smiles. The charity gala for child education was one of the most prestigious of the year, and Alexander Reed, as the main sponsor, was a mandatory presence, but he wasn't there just out of protocol. That night, something unsettled him, even though he couldn't name it. While conversing with the governor and other influential businessmen, his attention was captured by an unexpected sight across the room. Clara. She was different. The deep, blue dress hugged her curves with subtle elegance, and her hair, tied in a low bun, revealed the delicate line of her neck. It wasn't just her beauty that made him divert his attention from the political conversation. It was the lightness in her laughter, the way her eyes lit up as she listened attentively to the man beside her. A man Alexander didn't recognize, Richard Grant, a name that echoed in some social columns and meetings Alexander often ignored. Young, a promising lawyer, sharp smile, the kind of man who knew how to win over audiences, and women. Especially those who weren't used to being seen, and Clara was being seen. Richard spoke with enthusiasm, and Clara listened with a sparkle in her eyes that Alexander couldn't remember ever seeing in her. There was a spontaneity there that didn't exist in the silent dinners at the mansion or the formal gatherings at corporate events. It was as if she were alive, and he, Alexander, was invisible in that setting. An unexpected tension ran through his chest, a silent sting, almost ridiculous, that he only recognized when he gripped his champagne glass too tightly. Jealousy? Was that jealousy? It didn't make sense. He wasn't the type of man who let primitive emotions affect him. And yet, there he was, staring at his own wife as if seeing her for the first time. Clara let out a soft laugh. Richard casually touched her arm. Alexander took a deep breath. Without thinking, he crossed the room. Each step echoed on the marble like a silent declaration. When he approached the couple, Richard looked up and extended his hand politely, not even seeming intimidated. "Alexander Reed," he said with a firm voice, looking directly at the man. Clara's husband. The word husband came out with a weight he hadn't known he carried. It wasn't just an introduction. It was a marker, a reminder, a line drawn in the sand. Clara looked at him, surprised. Not because he was there, but because of the way he was looking at her. For the first time in 2 years, his eyes were on her, and there was something there. A warmth, a presence that had never existed before. Richard smiled diplomatically and stepped away, under the pretext of getting a drink. Clara stayed. The silence between them was familiar, but now it carried a different texture, dense, unstable. "I didn't know you'd come," she said after a few seconds. "You look stunning," he replied, almost not realizing what he was saying. Clara furrowed her brow slightly. Alexander rarely commented on her appearance, or anything really. "Thank you," she murmured, confused but not looking away. He wanted to say more. He wanted to explain why he was there, why he had crossed the room like a man hungry for something he had never known he desired. But pride still spoke louder, and fear even louder, so he just offered his arm in a courteous, almost robotic gesture. "May I?" Clara hesitated, then, as if accepting an invitation into unknown territory, placed her hand on his arm. They walked, in silence among the guests, but something had changed. It wasn't the silence of habit, of indifference. It was a silence filled with unanswered questions, with glances that lingered longer than necessary. Alexander watched her from the corner of his eye, the way she walked with discreet elegance, how she spoke to other guests with a lightness he had never explored. She had a life of her own, a soul, desires, stories, and he had never asked about any of them. Back at the table, as the charity auction took place in the background, he found himself wondering how it would have been if they had met differently. If their first conversation hadn't been mediated by contracts, if he had been less impenetrable, if he had had the courage to look at her the way he was doing now, before. Clara, in turn, felt unsettled. There was a new warmth in Alexander's gaze, a presence that went beyond his impeccable posture. He was there, really there, not as a businessman, not as the man who paid the family's bills, but as a man, as a husband, and strangely, as someone who was beginning to see her. When the night came to an end and they descended the marble staircase to fetch the car, Clara stumbled slightly in her heel. Alexander instinctively held her hand. The touch was brief but left a trace. Neither of them commented, but both felt it. Inside the car, the driver waited. Alexander opened the door for her, as usual, but this time he hesitated before getting in. He looked at her with a mix of regret and something harder to name, and then, instead of settling into the back seat, with his eyes glued to his phone or a stock report, he just looked. Clara felt the weight of that gaze on her skin, as if each layer of their silence was slowly being peeled away. They didn't say anything more that night, but when they arrived at the mansion and said goodbye in front of the staircase that led to their separate wings, Clara didn't enter immediately. She stood there for a few seconds, looking at him, as if waiting for something that she didn't know if would come. Alexander, in turn, watched as she climbed one step, then another, and before she disappeared down the hall, he said something that echoed like a whisper between the marble walls. "I liked seeing you tonight. Really." She stopped, didn't turn around, but smiled. And that smile, even though he didn't see it, was the first brick in a bridge that until then seemed impossible to cross. The morning after the gala, the Reed mansion looked exactly the same. Silent, impeccable, impersonal. But there was something different in the air, almost imperceptible. A hint of emotion lingered between the marble columns and cold hallways, like a musical note that continues to vibrate even after the melody has ended. Alexander woke up earlier than usual. He ran his fingers through his hair, still damp from the shower, and stood in front of the mirror for a few minutes, staring not at the perfectly tailored suit, but into his own eyes, trying to decipher what he was feeling. It wasn't just jealousy. It was unease. It was the strange awareness that, for the first time in years, he wasn't in control of what was beginning to grow inside him. Clara also woke up early. She had an appointment at the Central Library, where she was restoring a rare edition of an 18th-century manuscript. She took a deep breath as she walked through the main hallway, expecting, well, she wasn't exactly sure what. But Alexander didn't show up, and maybe because of that she felt a slight disappointment she wouldn't admit, even to herself. It was only that night back at the mansion that the unexpected happened. She was descending the stairs with a book in hand, ready to retire for the evening, when she heard his voice. Not from behind a door, not echoing from, say, a phone call, but right there, speaking directly to her. "Clara." She turned slowly. Alexander was standing by the bar in the living room, a nearly untouched glass of whiskey in his hand, with an oddly soft expression. "I'd like to talk, if you have a moment," he said, without his usual formal tone. Clara hesitated. She wanted to say she was tired, that she had work to finish. But the truth was she was more curious than tired. So she nodded. They sat across from each other with a low table between them and an emotional distance that was slowly but surely starting to give way. Alexander cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable being out of his comfort zone. "I wanted to thank you. For yesterday, for walking with me at the gala." He paused. "And for reminding me that there's a lot about you I never tried to know." Clara raised her eyebrows slightly. "That sounds like a long overdue acknowledgement," she responded, not harshly, but with the firmness of someone who had spent too much time being ignored. Alexander nodded. "Exactly, long overdue, but sincere." She looked at him for a few seconds, then softened her expression. "So, what do you want to know now?" Alexander took a deep breath, as if that simple question were an open door to unknown territory. "You always speak with passion about book restoration," he began. "But you never told me how you got started with it." Clara widened her eyes, slightly surprised. "That never seemed to interest you." "It's interesting to me now," he said with raw honesty. And for the first time, she spoke. She spoke of the grandfather who collected old books and let her turn the pages with cotton gloves, of the dusty afternoons in her school library, of the tears she shed when she restored the diary of a 19th-century woman whose words had almost been erased by time. Her voice was calm but full of soul, and Alexander listened, really listened. That conversation lasted over an hour, and when Clara said goodbye with a slight nod and a near-smiling good night, he remained, seated, the glass still full. What intoxicated him wasn't the alcohol, it was the new sensation of having crossed a boundary between the unknown and the possible. In the following days, small gestures started to appear. Nothing grand, but significant. Alexander sent flowers to Clara's office at the library. Not red roses or expensive orchids, but fresh lavender and small sprigs of rosemary, like the ones she used to plant when she lived with her parents. A simple note. "I saw this and thought of you." Clara stared at the arrangement for long, minutes not knowing how to react. That weekend he showed up at a rare bookbinding exhibition hosted by the university where she worked. He didn't announce it. He didn't bring an entourage. He just showed up. Discreet but present. Clara saw him from a distance, standing in front of a display case with volumes worn by time. And for a moment, she didn't see the CEO. She saw the man. She saw someone trying to understand her world, and not just fill it with his own steps. On the drive home, he commented on one of the books from the exhibition with unexpected knowledge. She laughed, surprised. "Did you research bookbinding before you went?" He shrugged, pretending casualness. "Let's just say, when you start paying attention, the world of the other person stops being invisible." Clara didn't respond. But the smile that escaped wasn't restrained anymore. At the mansion, coincidences started to appear. Invitations to cultural events sponsored by Reed Enterprises, plays, exhibitions, literary debates. Alexander always needed company, and Clara, after pretending to hesitate, accepted. It was like they were getting to know each other for the first time, as if the marriage, no matter how empty it had been, was now being rewritten, gesture by gesture, glance by glance. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Clara still carried scars. There were still days when silence settled in like an annoying reminder, and Alexander, although more present, still stumbled in the art of showing vulnerability. On one of these nights, during a dinner on the terrace, the personal waiter served them in silence when Alexander commented, "I wonder how long I've been living beside you, without really living with you." Clara put her cutlery down. 2 years, Alexander, 2 years of silence." He stared at his plate for a second. "Did you hate me for that?" She took a while to answer. "No, but I faded a little every week, like a candle forgotten in a corner." That sentence hung in the air. There was no way to counter it, no justification. There was only the sound of silent guilt, but still. There was a beginning. That night, when they said goodbye, Alexander extended his hand toward Clara, as if he didn't want the moment to slip away. She hesitated, touched his hand with the tips of her fingers. It was quick, shy, but full of meaning. The flame which once flickered far away was now gaining substance, and what once was mere forced coexistence was slowly, ever so slowly, starting to look like real closeness. But would gestures be enough? Would Clara open her heart to a love that had arrived so late, or had time, despite all the efforts, already hardened the walls around her soul too much? Mornings at the Reed mansion had always been marked by the subtle hum of the coffee machine, footsteps echoing on marble floors, and the distant clink of dishes set by silent staff. But that Tuesday, a new sound infiltrated this scene. Clara's muffled laughter coming from the kitchen. Alexander, standing by the main staircase, stopped instinctively. It wasn't an uproarious laugh. It was a contained, almost shy sound, but genuine. That simple laugh was like a beam of light in a room that had long been dark. He found her with her sleeves rolled up, her hair casually pulled back, and a floral apron tied with a crooked bow at the back. She was teaching the new cook, a short Mexican woman, while they prepared a pancake recipe Clara had learned from her grandmother. Alexander didn't say anything right away. He just watched. The spontaneity of the scene unsettled him. Clara seemed at peace and so different from the reserved woman he shared public appearances with. She noticed his presence a few seconds later. "Good morning," she said, wiping her hand on the apron. "Good morning," he replied, quieter than he had intended. Clara hesitated. "Would you like some coffee?" It was a simple question, but it felt like an invitation to break their old routine. Alexander nodded, and for the first time in 2 years they had breakfast together, nothing formal. Just the two of them, sitting at the kitchen counter, sharing pancakes, comments about the recipe, and silences that no longer bothered them. In the warmth of the kitchen, something was shifting. In the days that followed, this new closeness gained momentum. They started to run into each other more often in the hallways, and instead of just nods or quick glances, there were words, questions, sometimes even a joke. It wasn't rehearsed, it was light, it was human. One evening during an impromptu dinner, spaghetti with pre-made sauce and cheap wine, something completely new to the mansion, Clara spoke about her childhood. "I used to hide in my grandmother's attic to read books, because my mum said I'd end up with weak eyes and a soft heart." Alexander laughed genuinely. "And did you?" "Weak eyes, yes. As for the heart, I think I haven't decided yet." He stared at her for a few seconds. He wanted to say something. He wanted to ask what might have happened if her heart hadn't been pushed into a marriage of convenience. But the fear of hearing the answer silenced him. The next day, Clara found a restored rare poetry book on her desk, with a simple dedication. "For the eyes that still see beauty in the cracks." There was no signature, but she knew where it came from. That same week, on an especially cold night, they were stuck in the mansion because of a sudden snowstorm. The staff had left early, and they found themselves alone with the sound of the wind howling against the windows. Clara made chamomile tea and offered a cup to Alexander, who was in the reading room. He accepted with a nod and pulled a blanket to share with her on the sofa. The gesture was natural, almost instinctive, but as they sat side by side, their shoulders brushed, and their eyes met for longer than usual. "Do you think the silence between us was a choice?" she asked, breaking the warm atmosphere with a sharp question. Alexander took a while to respond. "No. I think it was cowardice." The answer didn't come with drama. It came with the quiet sadness of someone owning up to their own omission. Clara didn't retort, but the way she gently rested her head on the back of the sofa without pulling away from him said more than any words. There was an old tiredness there, and yet a stubborn spark of hope. In the days that followed, small gestures became frequent. Alexander started showing up at unpredictable times in the library, where Clara restored books, bringing coffee or just a knowing look through the window. During one of these moments, she caught him holding a damaged book carefully, almost as if afraid of breaking something too fragile. "Are you starting to like my books?" she asked, smiling. I'm starting to understand what they mean to you, he replied without looking away. Their conversations deepened. Alexander spoke of his strict childhood, the expectations he carried since he was 10, when his name was already associated with inheritance and responsibility. He spoke about drawing, yes, drawing, that he loved doing as a child, but abandoned at 15 when his father tore up an entire notebook saying, "Art doesn't build legacy." Clara listened in silence, and in the end she simply said, "You can still draw if you want to. What builds legacy isn't what others expect. It's what we leave behind when we stop hiding." That night, Alexander went to bed feeling lighter, and before closing his eyes, he searched his phone for an art supply store. As contradictory as it was, discovering the broken side of each other didn't push them apart. It brought them closer. It was like seeing cracks in porcelain and still finding the piece more beautiful than a new one. But not everything was easy. One morning, Clara found an old family heirloom necklace hidden in a drawer in Alexander's office. She recognized it immediately. It was her mother's. The piece had been pawned years before the financial crisis. And now it was there, intact. She didn't say anything at that moment, but something lit up inside her. A doubt. An uncomfortable memory. A beacon she pretended not to see, but that was beginning to shine light on forgotten questions. And still that night, when Alexander invited her to dinner, just the two of them at home, no formalities, she accepted. During dessert, he got up, grabbed a small box from the sideboard, and handed it to her with hands that trembled discreetly. "I found this a while ago. Bought it back. I thought it should be with you." Clara opened the box and saw the necklace. The same one she had, found hours earlier. She didn't say anything. Just closed the lid slowly. "Thank you," she said finally. But the smile wasn't complete, Alexander noticed, but he didn't press. He knew some answers weren't ready to emerge. Still, when she stood up to leave, he walked her to the stairs. And, without thinking, held her hand for a few seconds. She didn't pull away. And that was more than he could have hoped for that night. When Alexander announced that he needed to go to Charleston for a meeting with investors and suggested that Clara accompany him, she stood silent for a moment. The proposal seemed simple. The city was charming, the agenda light, and he justified it by saying they could take the opportunity to visit the gallery where a rare collection of colonial books would be displayed. But Clara knew. She knew that the invitation went beyond aesthetics or convenience. It was a gesture, a request, a space to see what could still grow between them. Far from the cold corridors of the mansion and the suffocating weight of conventions, she accepted. Not on impulse, but because deep down she wanted to see how far Alexander's new version could go. The trip began with a comfortable silence. The Reed Enterprises jet was luxurious, like everything around Alexander, but he seemed less interested in the comfort and more focused on every expression of hers. Clara, on the other hand, had a book on her lap but wasn't reading. She was peeking through the windows, watching the change in the sky, the distance from the city, the possibility of breathing away from the routine. Upon arriving in Charleston, they were greeted by a humid breeze, the salty scent of the sea, and a sky painted in golden hues. The city seemed made of memories and promises. The boutique hotel, where they stayed, had historical charm and cozy details. 2 rooms, separate of course, but with a shared balcony overlooking the central square. That first evening, they dined together in a restaurant with old wooden floors, amber lights, and soft jazz playing in the background. The conversation flowed. Clara spoke about the exhibition they would visit the next day, and Alexander listened attentively, asking questions that revealed more than curiosity. They revealed a desire for connection. During dessert, an extra glass of wine made her relax. She laughed at something he said about the tight suit he hated wearing at events, and for the first time, she saw Alexander tilt his head back slightly, laughing too, carefree. "No pretenses. You have a beautiful laugh," she commented, a little surprised. "And you have a way of looking that disorients me," he replied without hesitation. Clara blushed, but she didn't look away. Not this time. As they left the restaurant, the breeze had turned colder. Clara instinctively crossed her arms. Without saying anything, Alexander removed his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The touch was brief, but firm. A simple care, without ulterior motives, and yet full of unspoken intentions. "Thank you," she whispered, feeling the warm fabric against her skin. "I'm just trying to make up for 2 years of absence," he said, looking ahead. They walked back to the hotel in silence. It wasn't the silence of distance. It was the silence before what truly mattered. When they arrived, Clara hesitated at the door of her room. They were about to say goodnight, but something inside her, and him, didn't want that night to end like this. Alexander made a move to say goodnight, but she turned, heading toward the shared balcony. "It's still too early to sleep," she said, sitting on the wicker chair. Alexander followed. He sat beside her without hurry. The view was serene. Old street lamps lit the square, couples walked slowly, and the sound of the central fountain filled the air with a steady melody. "Sometimes I think," she began in a low voice, "that maybe we would have worked if we had started differently." "I think about that too," Alexander replied, looking ahead, still not facing her. "But sometimes things need to start the wrong way, to teach us what's right." She stared at him. He turned his face slowly, and then silence. But not the empty silence of their old dinners. It was a dense silence, filled with everything their eyes said and the words didn't dare touch. Alexander raised one of his hands and gently moved a strand of Clara's hair that the wind kept blowing into her eyes. The gesture was soft, intentional, intimate, and in that exact moment, without words, he leaned in. The kiss wasn't urgent. It was slow, almost shy, as if each was asking permission from the other. Their lips met gently, exploring the newly built space between two strangers who were finally starting to recognize each other. Clara felt the world spin slowly. The taste of wine still lingered on her tongue. The touch of his hand on her neck was warm, respectful. There was no rush, there was presence. When they pulled away, neither said anything. They just looked at each other. She with misty eyes, he with a chest in conflict between relief and guilt. "Good night, Clara," he murmured, as if each syllable carried an apology and a promise. "Good night, Alexander," she replied, still with her lips slightly parted. She entered first. He remained there for a few minutes, staring at the street, as if trying to decipher what had just happened. That night neither of them slept early. In their respective rooms, separated by a thin wall, they both wondered, what did that kiss mean? A beginning, a mistake, a crack in the wall they had built, or all of that together? The next day came with a cloudy sky and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. They met in the hotel lobby, ready to visit the book gallery. They were a little quieter, but not uncomfortable. There was a tension, yes, but it was a living, pulsating tension, like that of someone starting to walk on a bridge still being built. During the exhibition, Clara spoke about the books with her usual sparkle in her eyes. Alexander watched more. Then he listened. The passion she had, the delicate gestures she made when touching the displays, the silent respect she had for the old stories. She, in turn, noticed how he stayed by her side. Not ahead, not behind, by her side. The whole time. When they left, they had lunch at a small restaurant where they tried local dishes and shared a pecan pie. He listened as she spoke about the idea of writing a book someday. She listened as he told her that sometimes he still dreamed of drawing, alone, in an open field, far from any obligation. "Maybe we just need to relearn how to dream, Alexander," she said almost jokingly. "Maybe," he replied, gently touching her fingers on the table. And in that touch, there was an unspoken pact. They still didn't know what they would be, but they knew what they didn't want to be anymore, and in a way that was already a beginning. Silverwood Estate seemed like something out of an old book. The Reed family's property, situated on the outskirts of the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia, was known for its fields that danced with the wind and the centuries-old trees that kept secrets in their twisted branches. The Georgian-style mansion, while grand, gave off a melancholic nostalgia, as if each wall had heard more silence than music. Alexander hadn't returned to Silverwood in nearly 5 years. Since he had taken over the presidency of the company, he had avoided that place like someone avoids poorly healed wounds. But now, after the trip to Charleston and the kiss that still burned in his memory, something inside him pushed him to open old doors. And Clara was the only person he wanted to cross that threshold with. She accepted the invitation with surprise, but no resistance. There was a mix of curiosity and caution in her eyes. They didn't know what to expect, but both felt they needed to step out of neutrality. They needed a place where the noise of the past could be heard with honesty. They arrived on a cloudy afternoon, with dry leaves scattered across the stone entrance. Clara got out of the car with a scarf tied in her hair and a serene expression. Alexander watched her walk slowly toward the iron gate, as if she were approaching a living memory. "Did you spend part of your childhood here?" she asked, her gaze focused on the fields. "From 8 to 23. It was my refuge and my prison." She turned her face, intrigued. "What do you mean? My father wanted me to inherit the company, but back then, all I wanted was to—" "Draw trees, these trees," he said, pointing to the ones swaying in the distance. Clara smiled, surprised. "You drew?" "I did. With charcoal pencils. I had a box hidden behind the fireplace until he found out." Clara didn't ask what happened afterward. His silence spoke for itself. Inside the house, the lights were on, the fireplace crackled, and the smell of fresh pine filled the air. An elderly housekeeper named Mabel greeted them with an emotional smile and teary eyes upon seeing Alexander. "You've grown too much to fit the memories I have, young Reed." He hugged Mabel with a warmth Clara hadn't yet seen. There was something raw in that moment, and Alexander stripped of the layers he wore in Boston. Dinner that night was simple but intimate. They had homemade soup, freshly baked bread, and aged red wine from Silverwood's cellar. Mabel retired, early, leaving the two of them alone in the music room, where an old piano sat covered in dust. "I used to play this," Clara said, sitting down carefully at the keys. When no one could hear me, she began to play a soft old melody. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he was closer to her. "You know, sometimes, when I look at you, I'm afraid it's too late." She stopped playing. "Too late for what?" "For everything. To fix things, to start over, to say that I wish I had known you like I'm getting to know you now." Clara took a deep breath. Her heart was racing, but she didn't want to be swept away by emotion. There were still doubts, wounds, unanswered questions. "Then show me who you are, Alexander. No script, no armor." He looked at her for a long time, then stood up. He walked over to the fireplace and pulled up a loose board from the floor. From underneath it, he took out an old wooden box. When he opened it, Clara saw dozens of folded sheets, drawings, trees, houses, hands, birds, and in the center, an unfinished portrait. The face of a woman looking off into the distance, drawn with soft lines and melancholic eyes. "I stopped drawing the day he said it was weakness." Clara touched the paper, as if touching an exposed wound. "This isn't weakness, Alexander. This is so." He smiled, but there was moisture in his eyes, and there in that old room, surrounded by history and shadow, they moved closer. It wasn't a sudden movement. It was one step at a time, both emotional and literal. When their lips touched again, there was no surprise. There was certainty. That kiss was different from the first, firmer, more engaging, as if they both finally knew they were in sync. They climbed the stairs side by side. The guest room was prepared for Clara, but she didn't enter. Alexander opened the door to his old room. Clara looked around, taking in the dark furniture, the old books, the watercolor painting hanging above the bed. It was a boy's room that had been forced to grow up too soon. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I am," he replied. "But only if you want." She entered. What happened that night wasn't hurried. It wasn't blind desire, it was tenderness. Hands that touched with reverence. Clothes slowly unbuttoned, as if each button was an emotional barrier being overcome. Sighs, glances, breathless pauses, slow kisses, and warmth that didn't come just from their bodies but from the liberation. It was the first time they made love. But more than that, it was the first time they gave themselves to each other with truth, no contracts, no duties, no shields. Later, lying under the thick blanket of the old bed, Clara rested her face on his chest and whispered, "Do you think we can go back to reality after this?" Alexander stayed silent for a moment. Then he answered, "I don't want to go back to what it was. I want to build a new reality. With you." Clara closed her eyes, but the smile on her lips remained, and even though the world outside was waiting, there, between the walls of Silverwood Estate, there was only one time. The now, but not all pasts accept being buried so easily. It was late afternoon when Clara returned to the mansion in Boston, bringing with her the lightness of the last days spent at Silverwood. The shared smiles, the delicate gestures, the first night together, everything still lived within her like a warm breeze resisting the arrival of winter. But the mansion, despite its unchanged appearance, seemed to carry a different silence now, heavier, denser. The next day, while organizing documents from her restoration studio, Clara found the envelope. It had no return address, only her name written in elegant, firm handwriting. It lay on her desk between work files. Upon opening it, she found copies of bank documents and an old contract between the Reed family and a law firm representing the Bennetts. She read it once, then again, and the third time, with her hands shaking. The contents were clear. Reed Enterprises had paid off $1 million debt of the Bennett family, more specifically, her father's debt. The documents were dated just a few months before the announcement of the marriage. And further down, in cold letters, there was a clause mentioning a union agreement between heirs as part of the debt restructuring. Clara felt her stomach turn. Her mind tried to rationalize, telling her that this could be a misunderstanding, an unfortunate coincidence, but her heart bled with the brutal realization that maybe her marriage had indeed been a transaction, a ransom coin, a handover disguised as an alliance. She jumped up from the chair impulsively, the papers still in her hands. She walked toward the main hall as if looking for air, as if fleeing something that was catching up with her too quickly. Alexander was coming in from the company when she intercepted him in the hallway. Her gaze was enough for him to know something was wrong. "Where did you get this?" she asked, holding out the documents, her voice firm but choked. He took the envelope, scanned it quickly, and froze. "Clara, He started, but the sentence didn't find its way. "So it's true," she insisted, her eyes watery. "I was a debt paid off with wedding rings." Alexander took a step toward her, but she stepped back. "I knew there were agreements," he said. "Finally. But I never knew all the details. It was my father who handled everything. You just what?" she interrupted, bitterness in her voice. "Signed, accepted, stayed silent." His silence confirmed more than any explanation. Clara felt as if everything they had built in the past few days, every look, every touch, every word, was now surrounded by smoke. As if it were hard to separate what had been sincere from what had been just the consequence of a neatly tied contract. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she whispered, more pained than angry. "Why did you let me believe that at least now there was truth between us?" Alexander lowered his eyes, not out of shame, but because he didn't know how to face what he saw in hers. "Because I was afraid of losing you just when I started to find you." The words hung in the air, too beautiful to erase the pain, but still insufficient. Clara walked past him without saying another word, climbing the stairs with firm steps. She locked herself in her room and for the first time in a long while cried. But it wasn't a loud cry. It was a silent, dense cry, falling like the rain that began to tap against the window. A cry from someone who felt sold, someone who, for a moment, thought she was being chosen, and discovered that perhaps she was just accepted as part of a negotiation. Alexander stayed downstairs, frozen. He knew he couldn't reverse the past, but what tortured him was realizing that omission was also a form of betrayal. That night they slept in separate rooms. For the first time since Silverwood they were apart, and further apart than ever. Clara tried to organize her thoughts, but what hurt the most wasn't the content of the documents. It was the silence that followed. It was the fact that he hadn't trusted her enough to reveal an ugly truth. Because even ugly, truths have the power to build something solid. Lies by omission don't. The next day, when she woke up, she found a note under her door. It was from Alexander. "Clara, I can't change what was done before us, but I want the chance to build what comes next. If you'll allow me, I'll seek the full truth, even if it hurts, because only the truth can honor what we're trying to be. A." She read and reread those lines, trying to feel what still remained there. She didn't know if she believed him, but she knew she needed to understand. She needed to know how far the truth went and where manipulation began. Later that same day, Clara received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end simply said, "Look at the records in Theodore Reed's name. Everything's there, including the real reason for the marriage," and hung up. The name of Alexander's father echoed in her mind like a drum. Theodore had always been in the background of the story, but now he was taking center stage. Clara descended to the library and began searching, determined. If Alexander wanted to bring the truth to light, then she would do the same. But she wouldn't wait passively. She had been passive for far too long. And at the same time, high up in the mansion, Alexander was packing a small suitcase. He was going to travel. He needed to look his father in the eye. He needed to face the man who had shaped his life like a pawn in business, and this time he wouldn't lower his head. In the hallway, they crossed paths for a brief moment. He with a determined expression, she with a hurt look on her face. They didn't exchange words, just a nod, a recognition that something important was about to be unearthed. But what would come next, the healing or the ruin, was still a mystery that they both would have to face, separately, for now. The flight to Manhattan was silent. Alexander stared out the jet window at the city, as if viewing a landscape for the last time before leaving it behind for good. It was here that Theodore Reed, his father, lived, in the top of a building surrounded by glass, marble, and a security army. But what made that place insurmountable weren't the walls. It was the unspoken words, the wounds camouflaged by figures, and the pride molded from steel. Alexander hadn't visited his father in almost a year. Since taking on more power at the company, their conversations had been limited to dry meetings, full of coded phrases and advice that sounded more like orders. But now it wasn't about the company. It was about something much deeper. About Clara. About himself. He was greeted by George, Theodore's loyal assistant, who guided him through silent hallways to the office, where old Reed spent most of his days. Upon entering, Alexander saw his father sitting behind a massive oak desk, reading a report as if the world outside didn't exist. "I thought you wouldn't come," Theodore said, not lifting his eyes from the paper. "I thought I should look into your eyes when I asked about the Bennett debt," Alexander replied. Cold and direct, Theodore set the papers down with a bored sigh. He slowly rose, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt with that familiar tick Alexander had known since childhood. "So, she finally found out," he murmured. "Took longer than I thought." "Is it true?" Alexander pressed, his jaw tense. "The marriage, was it part of the deal?" His father walked over to the liquor shelf, poured himself a drink and downed half the glass before answering. "Of course it was. I thought you'd have figured that out by now." It was obvious. Alexander felt the ground give way beneath him. He knew deep down he would hear that, but there had been a foolish hope that it wouldn't be so raw, so surgical. "You used me, used Clara, as currency, as a shield." Theodore shrugged. "I used what was necessary. It was that or watch." The Reed name sink again into the mud. "The Bennetts were broke. Your marriage saved 2 families, Alexander. Be grateful." Grateful, he took a step forward. "Grateful for being pushed into a life I didn't choose, for marrying an incredible woman without knowing what she meant. Because everything was manipulated by you. She's beautiful, polite, refined. I don't see what the drama is about," his father retorted coldly. Alexander clenched his fists. His voice was low, but each word was a cut. "You talk about her like she's a possession, but Clara is everything you'll never understand. And that's exactly why I had to come here, to tell you that I'm done. I'm done repeating this pattern of control, silence, and convenience." Theodore looked at him with a mix of contempt and surprise. "You're going to throw it all away for an emotional whim? It's not a whim. It's truth. It's affection. It's courage. Old Reed laughed scornfully. What do you know about courage, Alexander? You were always the boy who obeyed, the one who did as he was told, who carried the legacy in his arms like a trophy. And still, he interrupted firmly, I'm the only one in the family trying to fix things, trying to feel, even after a lifetime of learning not to feel anything. Theodore fell silent. The whiskey now seemed bitter in his mouth. Alexander walked toward the door. Before leaving, he looked over his shoulder. You don't define my legacy. Not my marriage, not my life. You'll regret this, his father growled. Alexander simply replied, I've already regretted for too long, and he left. In the elevator, his heart raced as if he'd run a marathon. But it wasn't fear. It was liberation. For the first time, he felt like he was breaking an invisible chain, the one that had held him since childhood, the one that said love was weakness, truth was dangerous, and feeling was a luxury for the weak. On the way back to the airport, he grabbed his phone. He wanted to text Clara, but he stopped. She deserved more than a message. She deserved a look, a clean conversation. No half-truths. He arrived at the mansion early in the evening. The sky over Boston was coppery, as if it too was in transition. Clara was in the backyard garden, watering the lavender. She saw him from afar, and for a second stopped. Her hand still held the watering can, but her whole body seemed attentive to his approach. Alexander walked toward her in silence. He stopped a few steps away, waiting for permission. I went to see him, he said, without preamble. Clara didn't answer, but her eyes said, keep going. My father confirmed everything, the debt, the deal, and that they used the marriage as part of the solution. She took a deep breath, but didn't move. And you, she asked, her voice firm. What was your part in this? My part was accepting the role he gave me. I didn't ask, I didn't question. I let myself be led because it was easier, because it hurt less. But I know that doesn't absolve me. Clara set the watering can down on the grass. She looked at him with steady eyes, but not hostile. You lied through silence, Alexander, and that hurts too. I know, and that's why I want you to hear it from me, without filters. I don't want to live the way he lived anymore. I don't want to be a Reed like him. I want to be someone who builds, who feels, who takes responsibility. He took a step forward, but I can only do that with you and for you, if you still want to walk by my side. Clara took a while to answer. There were so many emotions contained in that moment that a simple phrase wouldn't be enough. But she knew he was different, that something in him had really broken and to finally start over. She looked away for a moment. She gazed at the lavender in the evening light, and then, with a tired but sincere sigh, said, I need time, Alexander, and truth, nothing more, no promises, no apologies, just truth. He nodded. It's all I want to give you. They stood in silence for a few seconds, then she slowly turned and entered the house, leaving him there. But before crossing the door, she looked over her shoulder. A brief glance, almost imperceptible, and in that gesture there was more hope than he had expected to find. The days that followed Alexander's return were silent, not because of distance, but because of the need for digestion. Clara felt like someone who had woken up from a sweet dream, only to discover that, beneath the softness, there was cracked ground. Still, something inside her didn't want to retreat. For the first time in a long time, she wanted to go all the way. She wanted to know the truth, the whole truth. No noise, no promises, no filters. She started with public records. She combed through company files, dug into legal databases, and spoke with former employees of her father's company. With every new piece of information, another puzzle piece fell into place. She discovered that the Bennett family's debt was real vast, and that Reed Enterprises had not only taken on the financial responsibility, but also gained control over part of the remaining assets of the Bennett family's old bookstore. However, the more she dug, the more she noticed something important. Not everyone knew about the marriage agreement as a bargaining chip. Her father seemed oblivious to this condition. At least in the records and correspondence exchanged with lawyers, there wasn't a single line indicating, that he knew his daughter's hand had been offered along with the payment. That didn't lessen the damage, but it shifted the axis of the pain. Clara realized that maybe not everyone had intended to offer her as part of a negotiation. Maybe it was Theodore. Maybe it was a cold, isolated act, typical of someone who sees people as replaceable pieces. She sat for hours in front of her mother's diary, searching for any mention of the time around the wedding. She found only one sentence written in blue ink just before the ceremony. She looks scared, but there's something in her eyes that says, "I'll survive." That sentence burned, because yes, she had survived, even without knowing exactly what she was living through. It was on a late afternoon while returning from the public library that she ran into Richard Grant. He was leaning against a black sports car, sunglasses on his face, and that slightly rehearsed smile he always wore. "Clara!" "What a coincidence," he said, as if fate still had room in this script. She smiled faintly with the elegance of someone who was no longer the same woman from weeks ago. "Hello, Richard." He walked a few steps with her, casual, as if there were no agenda behind the approach. "I heard you and Alexander have been distant," he commented after a calculated silence. Clara kept her gaze ahead. "And you've been getting a lot of information, it seems." Richard laughed. "It's a small world, Clara, and you know I've always admired you, even before." She stopped, turned slowly. "Before what exactly?" He hesitated for a second. But like every man who underestimates the intelligence of a wounded woman, he tried to push forward. "Before you got lost in this stifled marriage, I always thought you deserved someone who really saw you." She looked at him with a calmness that unsettled him. "You're right about one thing, Richard. I do deserve to be seen, and for a long time Alexander didn't see me, but now at least he's trying to look. You, on the other hand, you've always looked at me as an opportunity." Richard furrowed his brow. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, you do," she interrupted, her voice firm. "You showed up when you heard about the crisis, made sure to get close when you saw the crack. Tried to slip in through the gaps as if I were fragile enough not to notice." He fell silent for a moment, but the smile disappeared. Clara took a step forward. "What I lived through didn't break me, it built me. And if one day I choose someone, it will be for love, not need." She walked away, not giving him a chance for another word. As she walked back to the mansion, her heart beat firmly, not from fear but from affirmation. Because she finally felt in control. She was no longer a piece in someone else's game. She was the one deciding her next steps. That night, Clara went up to the attic of the mansion, a place she rarely visited. She found old boxes of documents and photos. Among yellowed papers and Alexander's childhood belongings, she found something. That made her stop a sketchbook. She flipped through carefully. There were sketches of places, people, abstract forms. But in the middle of them there was something more recent. An unfinished portrait of her. Not idealized, not adorned. Clara, with a serious face, attentive eyes, and her mouth slightly parted, as if about to say something important, she recognized the style. It was his. On the last page, a scribble in small handwriting. "If one day I learn to listen with my heart, maybe she'll tell me what she never said with words." She closed the sketchbook slowly, and for the first time since discovering the debt, she felt a thread of tenderness run down her spine. Because despite everything, there had been effort. There had been change. There had been regret. And maybe that didn't erase what had been done, but it left room to choose what would come next. Clara slowly descended the stairs. She found Alexander in the library, flipping through an old book on art history. He looked up, surprised to see her there at that hour. She didn't speak immediately. She simply walked over to the chair beside him and sat. "I went after the truth," she said finally. Alexander closed the book. "And what did you find?" "That the debt was real. That the marriage was, yes, part of an agreement, but that you might have been used just as much as I was. The difference is that now you've decided to break the cycle, and I decided not to be just the consequence of someone else's decisions." He didn't respond, he just nodded. Clara crossed her legs, adjusted her hair, and looked at him firmly. "I won't promise that everything is forgiven." "Because it's not." But I can promise that I won't run away. Not from you, not from me." Alexander took a deep breath. He was about to speak, but she raised her hand, interrupting. "Just one more thing," she said, with a light glimmer in her eyes. "If you really want to start over, you'll have to learn to listen to me, and to draw yourself with your own colors, not with the strokes your father imposed on you." He smiled. "Not as a CEO, not as an heir, but as a man grateful to finally have found someone who saw even the most hidden cracks." Clara stood up and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned. "Tomorrow, after dinner, I want to show you a book I'm restoring. It's about choices." And she left. Alexander remained seated, the book still closed in his lap, his heart strangely light, and in that instant, without touching her, without saying another word, he knew there was still a path, and most importantly, it was real. The decision didn't come from an impulse. It came from an accumulation, from all the silences, all the pressures, all the masks Alexander Reed had worn for too long to uphold an empire built on pillars that no longer represented him. He didn't want to be an inherited name anymore. He wanted to be a real man. And above all, he wanted Clara to see that, not through words, but through actions. The first meeting after his visit to his father happened on a grey morning, in the glass-walled conference room at Reed Enterprises. The top executives were present. Everyone expected more of the same. Numbers, goals, cold forecasts. But Alexander entered without a suit, just with a shirt rolled up at the sleeves and a notebook in hand. He set his phone to silent and walked to the head of the table as if he were about to close a chapter, not just present a report. "From now on," he said, his voice calm and firm, "Reed Enterprises will be more than a profit machine. We're going to create a fund to support small family businesses at risk of bankruptcy, and I want it to carry my mother's name." A dense silence followed, broken only by discreet coughs and skeptical looks. One of the senior partners, Mr. Whitmore, tried to intervene. "This isn't in the capital expansion plan, Alexander. Is this charity?" "No," he replied without hesitation. "It's reparation, and its purpose." The words weren't said with a rebellious tone. They were said with the conviction of someone who had finally understood that legacy isn't about inheritance, but about awareness. In the following months, the fund was structured, with strict criteria and ethical processes. Clara, even without direct involvement, kept a watchful eye. She noticed the change, not only in his public actions, but in the man who came home. There was lightness where there had once been tension. There was presence where there had once been absence. He now made a point of being nearby, not out of obligation, but by choice. He began to visit Clara's studio more, often offering help, even if it was just to clean brushes or organize damaged covers. He asked about the books, the authors, the textures. He spent hours listening to stories he would have never allowed himself to hear before. One afternoon, as Clara applied a special varnish to an old edition of Italian short stories, Alexander sat beside her with a sketchbook in his lap. "I promised myself I'd return to this," he said without looking up, "but only if it was with freedom, not to please anyone, not to be accepted." She smiled. His strokes were firm, delicate. He was sketching a scene that Clara recognized little by little. It was the lavender garden at the mansion, with her sitting in the background, facing away, reading. "You drew me without me knowing? I've always been trying to understand." "You even before I knew how to look," she didn't reply, but the silence between them now was comfortable. It was filled with everything that didn't need to be said. The dinners became moments of connection, no formalities, no forks aligned by staff or flawless menus. Sometimes it was heated soup and bread with butter. Other times, just a glass of wine and a conversation until late. But always, there was presence. One evening, Clara watched him from the window upstairs. He was in the garden, pruning the lavender with gardening shears, and his sleeves rolled up. That simple, almost mundane image made her chest tighten, because she was finally seeing the man who had freed himself, not just from his father, the business, the contracts, but from himself. And it was this freedom that now sustained what they were building. She no longer felt like she needed to protect herself from him. Because now he offered shelter, not walls. On a cloudy weekend, Clara suggested they visit one of the old bookstores that was at risk of closing, a store that would be one of the first to benefit from the new fund. Alexander accepted without hesitation. During the visit, they spoke with the owner, an elderly man with a low voice and worn hands from handling fragile pages. He cried as he told them that this bookstore had been the dream of his late wife. As they left, Alexander said nothing, but he held Clara's hand with a firmness that said everything. On the way back, they stopped for coffee in the city centre. They sat at a worn wooden table with old porcelain mugs and the soft sound of instrumental music playing in the background. "Do you still think about everything that happened at the beginning?" he asked with honesty. Clara looked out the window before responding. "I do. But not with pain, I think with understanding. What we lived in the beginning was like a house built on sand. But what we're doing now, it seems to have a foundation." Alexander nodded. "And do you think we can build more?" She smiled slightly. "I do, but I don't want promises. I want presence, constancy, choice." He held her hand on the table. "Then I choose, every day." That night, lying in the same bed, under the white sheets of the mansion that had once seemed like a mausoleum of silences, Clara felt something new in herself. It wasn't explosive passion. It was peace. It was the kind of love that comes after the storm when the earth is still damp, but the sky begins to clear. She turned to him and whispered, "I like who you're becoming." He smiled, his eyes closed. "I only discovered who I was, because you didn't give up on looking." The clock read almost midnight when Clara slowly got up and went down to the garden. The night was cool, and the breeze carried the scent of wet earth and lavender. She sat on the stone bench, hugging her knees. There, in the middle of the darkness, she felt whole, not because she had been rescued, but because she had chosen to stay. She had allowed herself to rebuild, with him, but most importantly with herself. And even though they didn't know what the future held, they knew that, from now on, everything they would live would be by choice. But before they could seal this new beginning, there was something still pulsing in Alexander's heart, a desire to transform not just the present, but also the past. And for that, he had a plan. One that would begin with handwritten vows. Silverwood Estate seemed even more alive that morning. The birds seemed to sing with more enthusiasm, the wind danced gently between the curtains on the veranda, and the sun, filtered through the ancient trees, cast golden patterns on the stone floor. It was as if nature itself knew that something special was about to happen there. There were no excess guests, no imported flowers, no press, no parade of labels. It was intimate, deliberately small. Just close friends, Mabel, the lifelong housekeeper, and the old silent gardener who had discreetly watered every corner of that place for decades. Clara wore a simple dress, white as the winter sky, light, flowing, with transparent sleeves, that danced in the wind. Her hair was loose, a small bouquet of lavender from the garden in her hands. Her eyes, they were calm, firm, as if she had learned to love with time and no longer with urgency. Alexander waited for her under the pergola covered in ivy and small hanging lights, the same lights Clara had chosen weeks earlier, saying she didn't want luxury, she wanted real light. He wore a light grey suit, no tie, his hair slightly tousled by the wind, with a sprig of lavender pinned to his pocket. The silence before the vows was heavy with everything they had lived up to that point. The loveless marriage, the high walls, the timid touches, the kiss under the veranda, the painful truths, the patient rebuilding. The justice of the peace simply nodded, giving them space to conduct the moment themselves. And it was Alexander who spoke first. "Clara," he began, his voice choked but steady, "when we first married, I didn't understand what love was. I thought it was enough to protect, provide, stay. But today I know that loving is listening, when you don't know what to say. It's staying when it would be easier to run. It's relearning every day." He took a deep breath. "I can't erase what's happened, but I can promise that from now on, every word will be chosen carefully, every silence will be shared, and every gesture will be by choice. Never again. By obligation. Clara looked into his eyes. She wasn't crying, but there was noble moisture there, of someone who feels deeply without making a scene. Then she began. Alexander, when you entered my life, I thought I'd be swallowed by it, that I'd fade away little by little, like a candle in a cold room. But over time you taught me that even the most unlikely love can bloom, if it's nurtured with truth. She gave a slight smile. I don't want perfection. I want presence. I want crooked laughter, dinners that aren't always warm, words that aren't always right, but spoken with an open heart. I promise, she said finally, to keep choosing you, even when we're silent, even when we disagree, even when life tries to push us back to what we were before. Alexander held her hands with restrained reverence. I accept your vows. And I offer mine again, he said, with a warmth in his voice that only someone who truly loves can carry. Mabel, emotional, handed them the new wedding bands. They weren't the same as the ones from the first marriage. These had been made by a local jeweler, crafted from silver with a subtle lavender detail carved on the inside, unseen by the outside world, but present all the time. Like their love, discreet but firm, they exchanged rings under the murmur of the wind, and when they kissed, there were no loud applauses, just light sighs, contained smiles and respectful silence, as if everyone knew that this kiss wasn't the first nor the last, but the most genuine of them all. After the ceremony, they sat at the wooden table under the centuries-old trees. They ate homemade bread, local cheeses, fresh fruits, nothing extravagant, but everything chosen with care. It was a banquet of simplicity and intention. Clara raised a glass of wine and, with a soft voice, said, "To those who stayed even when the bridge seemed to collapse." Alexander raised his glass right after, "And to those who learned to rebuild, together with their own hands." The afternoon passed in calm conversations, spontaneous laughter, and memories that began to form right there, before their eyes. It was as if the property, that place full of so much pain and inheritance, was being purified by the touch of real love. After the guests left, Clara and Alexander walked hand in hand through the gardens, without haste. They stopped in front of the lake where ducks silently glided and the leaves fell slowly. "Do you feel like we started over?" he asked. She thought for a moment. "No. I feel like we started right, and that changes everything." He moved closer, kissed the top of her head, and stood there just feeling her breath. There was no need for theatrical gestures. Just being. Later, as the golden light of the evening filled the rooms of the mansion, Clara lay on the sofa in the library with an open book on her lap. Alexander appeared with 2 mugs of tea and sat beside her, pulling a thin blanket over both of them. "Do you think I'm a little scared?" he confessed softly. Clara looked at him, surprised. "Scared of what?" "That all of this might be too fragile, that I might ruin it unintentionally." She smiled, gently stroking his hand. "Love is only fragile when it's denied. But ours, we see it, hear it, care for it. It will last, Alexander, because now it's no longer silence, it has a voice." He gently pulled her closer, and there, in the midst of old books, warm tea and synchronized breaths, life began again. Not with explosions, but with peace. But there was still something to come, something they didn't know yet, but that awaited them the next day, and would seal, once and for all, this new chapter. The morning after the vow renewal was serene, almost ceremonial. The sky over Silverwood was a delicate blue, and the morning breeze brought the fresh scent of lavender freshly bloomed. Clara woke up before the sun had fully risen. She walked, barefoot, to the veranda, wrapped in a light shawl, and stood there, watching the first rays of sunlight gilding the distant hills. Alexander joined her minutes later, still with messy hair and a sleepy smile. They didn't say anything for a while. They just shared that good silence, the kind that doesn't require explanations. There was something sacred about that beginning of the day, a tranquility only love that has survived the deepest pains can feel. "Can you imagine the future in 10 years?" she asked, resting her head on his shoulder. He took a while to respond. I can. But for the first time I don't feel in a hurry to get there, she smiled. Neither do I. Later they walked to the old orchard, which lay behind the greenhouse. There, among trees that had seen generations pass, Clara suggested something unusual. I want to plant an olive tree, she said, picking up a small sapling in a ceramic pot. Here? He asked, curious. Yes, olive trees grow slowly, but they live a long time. And even if it takes time, one day someone will sit under its shade and maybe not even know why, but they'll feel protected. I want to leave this here, as a promise, as a root. Alexander knelt beside her. Together they dug into the earth with their hands, no tools. It was symbolic, it was real. As they filled the hole with soil, Clara felt her eyes water. But it wasn't sadness. It was gratitude, for staying, for believing, for being brave enough not to run away. Then they sat on the grass, their fingers still covered in dirt, laughing at themselves like two children who had just built a sandcastle in the backyard. Do you think we've changed that much? He asked, observing her hands. I think we've just started to be who we should have been from the beginning, she replied, intertwining her fingers with his. That phrase echoed throughout the day. Because indeed, everything around them seemed different now, even though it was the same. The old house, the books, the garden, the kitchen where they had coffee. Everything had gained a new layer, like a second skin finally adjusting to what they felt inside. They returned to Boston 2 days later, with lighter bags and firmer hearts. At the mansion, everything was the same, but it no longer felt cold. Clara opened the windows upstairs, letting the sun in. She put fresh flowers in the pots along the staircase. Alexander replaced the heavy paintings with his own drawings, and, among them, a new illustration. 2 hands intertwined, planting an olive tree under the morning sky. The following week, they officially launched the support fund for families in crisis with a simple and symbolic event. The name? Root Project. Because that's what they wanted to leave, roots, not appearances. Clara also decided to start something new. She began writing a book, not about the marriage, not about the pain, but about what happens when 2 people decide to stay. When it's no longer about uncontrolled passion, but about serene choice, about affection sustained over time. Alexander, in turn, began drawing more frequently. He created a small studio in his father's old office, now transformed into a creative space. There he hung the first childhood sketches next to the more recent lines, as a reminder that no one needs to erase the past to write a new beginning. They just need to illuminate it with intention. One late afternoon, weeks later, Clara received an unexpected letter. It was from Mabel. Inside, there was an old photo of Silverwood, taken decades ago. In the image, Alexander's parents were still young, sitting under a tree that no longer existed. Behind the photo, written by hand, not all roots are visible. Some grow in silence and sustain all that will come. Clara closed her eyes and let a tear slip down. That night, sitting next to Alexander on the veranda of the mansion, she told him about the photo. He stayed silent for a while and then said, "You know, I think for a long time I tried to be a castle, big, impenetrable, imposing. But today, I just want to be solid ground. And let life grow over me." She hugged him, feeling his chest against hers. "And you are," she said with tenderness. "Finally you are." And there, under a sky that was beginning to fill with stars, they stayed, without needing to prove anything anymore, without fear of starting over. Because they knew that, despite the scars, or perhaps because of them, the love they had built now had roots deep enough to never be uprooted. And even if life still brought winters, now they had something they had never had before, a home within each other. But what neither of them knew is that one day, years ahead, someone from the outside would also find shelter there, under the shade of that silent olive tree, a silent witness to the love that resisted, reborn, and finally blossomed. In the end, this isn't just the story of a CEO who learned to feel. It's the story of a marriage that started as a contract and ended as a home, of a woman who had the courage not to fade away, of a man who dared to break the patterns of his own surname, and of 2 souls who chose to stay, even after everything, Because true love isn't about a perfect beginning. It's about a brave new beginning. And now I ask you, have you ever lived a love that needed to start from scratch? Do you believe it's possible to rebuild even after pain? Would you forgive if you felt you were truly chosen? Tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? And which part touched your soul the most? If this story spoke to you, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell and leave a like. It helps the channel grow and inspires us to keep telling stories that warm, heal and transform. And of course, share with someone who needs to believe that love, when it's real, always finds a way to bloom.